Beginning with the War of Independence, or topic divided in three main subtopics: reasons or causes of the War of Independence, then reasons or causes of the failure, then impact. If we begin with the causes of War of Independence, the question might be different as well. The question could, reasons would be same if we say causes of the Indian anger, or causes of the Indian dislike, or causes of the Indian sort of frustration. Those are the same. But if question relates to, for example, a war, so we will use the word war. If it uh, relates to anger, disappointment, we will turn them into a disappointment. If we see the variety of the question on this reasons of the Indian basically disliking or being unsatisfied, the oldest question, introduction of the social reforms by the British, such as education, caused the War of Independence in 1857. Then another question, just to pronounce, did educational reforms have a more important effect on the Indians than the social, religious, and economic ones introduced by the British during the years 1773 to 1856? Now, there's no war here. Timeline, we have to be careful. The timeline is ending 1856, because the war starts in the 1857. Only one reason we would not include in that. That is obviously the grease cartridge. Other reasons we can write down here, and we would be saying about the Indians basically effect, positive or negative effect. Mainly, uh, we write about the negative effects. If we move, just then if we, I have just highlighted another question, which is directly about the war. That is, again, did educational reforms have a greater effect on the Indians people than any other changes introduced by the British between? This is the same. Main question is, was the grease cartridge the main reason of the outbreak of the War of Independence? Do you agree, disagree? If we beginning with the causes of the War of Independence, we might remember, we might recall that was the grease cartridge was the first reason of the outbreak of the War of Independence. It is the most familiar one. What was that? There was a rumor. We don't know whether it was true or untrue. There was a rumor that uh, British are using new bullet that is covered with the uh, uh, that was greased or greased. Uh, Rumor was made up of the cow fat or pig fat, but it was never known. What was the reason behind that? Because we know British were always trying to improve their weapons. They were all time trying to modernize their weapons. Why they needed to grease their cartridges? Their weapons were coming mostly from the UK by sea because of the long traveling. Their weapons or their bullets were having negative effects of the winds and other issues. When they were using here, they were finding a lot of faults. So to cover up that fault, or to make up for that fault, they invented a new idea. If gunpowder sort of in bullets is covered with the grease, it would not malfunction. That was the overall background. When they it was rumored in January, February, that the bullet being used is a grease with a cow. Few people basically refused to use that. Most prominent was the Mangal Pandey. When he refused, then he was court-martialed and he was even hanged for that. The main crisis started in May 1757. Then the Indian soldiers in a great number refused to use that cartridge. How that cartridge was to be used? Famous. It was bitten, that it was used. So they just refused to use that. Uh, that led to uh, rebellion. What happened? Uh, the soldiers who refused, they were arrested. They were put behind the bars. It spread anger. Then other soldiers just stormed the jails and got their comrades released. From there, this war of independence started from the Meerut. Now, then another reason could be we say normally military causes. Always officers were the British and lower ranks were the from India, and their pays were lower. Indians could not be promoted being an officer. This was also not acceptable. In other reason that is known as the doctrine of lapse that was introduced in 1852. What was that? They had become basically British had become very powerful. They made a new law. If there's any princely states, if it is not having any legal here, the state would be taken over by the British. The main objection came from Maratha's Nana Sahib. He was the adopted son of the last Maratha Peshwa. His pension was stopped. Then there was the issue of the Rania Jhansi. Her husband died, and she became the ruler of the state of the Jhansi, but she was not allowed. And also, there happened another example of this the unfair use of doctrine of lapse was in the state of the Ud. Although it has the legal here, it took over the state of the Ud on the pretext that the current ruler is not properly governing that. Now, uh, Indian considered it just British ploy, doctrine of lapse was just a British ploy to create the Indian lands. It also added to their anger. Then there was an earlier issue of the replacement of the Persian language. In 1834, main language of Indians that time was the Persian or Sanskrit. When the language was changed, a lot of people became jobless. They were unable to find jobs. Yeah, they were not no more uh, relevant to British Empire. And Indians also thought that replacement of the Persian or Sanskrit with English is a take on their culture. It also became one of the reasons of Indian resentment or anger. Then there was also issue of the work of the Christian missionaries. There has been a question of the 10 marks on the work of the Christian missionaries. Was the work of the Christian missionaries the main reason of the Indian resentment before 1850? Now, what was the role of the Christian missionaries? Basically, a lot of British uh, missionary people were coming to spread Christianity in India. It was no, it should have been a normal routine affair, but the Indian objection was that they were basically supported and protected by the government. So Indian thought that this is a sort of government policy to convert Indians, whether they are a Muslim, Sikhs, or Christian, into Christianity. So that was not acceptable to Indians. Then there was the issue of the high taxation on the farmers. We also call the economic exploitation. For example, farmers did not have a choice to grow the crop of basically their choice. They were just given the policy by the EIC or government that times what type of crop they have to grow. If there's any drought like situation in any part of the Indians were still forced to pay the taxes. And there was also another issue involving that earlier in British were buying goods from the India. It was benefiting the Indians, but in the later year it has changed. They were just buying the raw material from India. For example, cotton they were buying. They were making clothes in their factories in UK. Then that all material was sent back to India. It was a cheaper and of a can be said of the good quality. So what happened? People were buying their sort of imported British goods. It negatively affected the local industry, causing unemployment. And then there was the issue of the social inequality. Indians were not considered equal to British. Lastly, there was also uh, reason of the disrespect of the Mughal emperor. What was that? In 1856, they needed a red fort. The British wanted to use this as their office. So simply they asked the last Mughal emperor, although he was weakened, to leave that red fort. He had to go to some obscure place So that was considered by the Indians interference or this sort of disrespect for the Indians. So these combined reasons became the cause of Indian resentment or anger. Now, in conclusion, we can make any reason more responsible than anyone else. Then there was in then another factor, another subtopic that is causes of the failure. Now, main question in past papers about the causes of the failure is lack of unity or lack of the coordination was the main cause of the Indian failure in the war. That question has been repeated. We can identify many reasons for the Indian failing in the war of independence. First reason could be identified as a uh, weaker military. Basically, Indian military they were just deserted from the British army when they had to lead themselves. They hadn't officer ranks, officers rank leaders in their army of the rebel army. They were not properly planning. Even if they had any weapons, weapons were the old one what they stole from the uh, British stores. When weapons were exhausted, there was no war supply. Then also there was the issue of the lack of economic resources. For example, the soldiers who were involved in the war, their pays were stopped. There was no replacement of the even weapons. Even there was a lack of unity in a way. Okay, there were different causes of fighting the war. Some, for example, Muslims were fighting with a fervor. They had an objective. They wanted to restore the old sort of Mughal empire, but the Hindus might have their own reasons. Like Nana Sahib, he was fighting that his pension should be restored. Even he many times announced if his pension is restored, he would no more fight. So was the case with the Rani of Jhansi. Then there was the issue of even treasury as well. For example, a lot of princely rulers were not interested in war of independence because they were more dependent on the British support to continue rule. The one example is given even in the book of that was the Maharaja Kashmir. He even sent 2,000 soldiers to the EIC to fight against the Indian rebels. Even the people of Punjab and Sindh were less interested. They were not happy uh, with that Bengal regiment, Bengal army, which has mainly rebelled because that Bengal army or Bengal units were used in the annexation of Punjab and Sindh. There was also lack of the popular support, means this war was more focused in a central India. There was no support from the north. There was no support from the south. Then there was the issue of the poor leadership. Overall leadership sort of appointed was Bahadur Shah Zafar. He was in a quite old age. He was 90 plus. He was not so much interested. He was just forced to proper leadership was not being provided. And to the side of the British, they had a better army. Even they had a better war supplies. They had better economic resources as well. There were certain other faults of the Indian soldiers. For example, if they took over certain areas of the India, there was a lot of vandalism. People were seeing that earlier condition was better when British were ruling. When the certain areas fall in the under the hands of the rebels, they were not organized. It created a law and order situation. Even British announced during the war if any rebels just surrenders and he stops fighting, he can be uh, pardoned. So such policies, such British policies, and the weaknesses of Indians basically mainly contributed in the failure of Indians in the War of Independence. If we start, if we start the third topic, that was the impact of the war. There have been just one question: the War of Independence of 1857 achieved nothing. Give reasons why you might agree and disagree with this statement. Here we have to give the two sides. Now, this question could be how successful was the War of Independence? We know always uh, wars, if anybody is a victorious, there would be some losses to to the victorious side as well. If any side loses, there might be certain gains of the losers as well. We are familiar as a whole, War of Independence was a failure. But if we recall, the most immediate cause of the War of Independence was the grease cartridge. Although British EIC or Britishers had won the war, but they had to continue ruling in India. So they needed support of the people, cooperation of the people. So they wanted to appease them as well because all time they cannot be in a warlike situation. And we are already aware even of the uh, Aurangzeb that he remained continuous in a warfare. So it had a very uh, devastating effects on overall the Mughal Empire. It became one of the root causes of the decline. Britishers were wise. They never wanted to be in the warlike situation. Now they wanted to please the Indians because they have already won the war. So main cause of the grease cartridge, they announced that grease cartridge would be no more used. Then another important factor, a reason of the war of independence was the doctrine of lapse. It had created bad impression in the minds of the Indians. Britishers announced then doctrine of lapse would no more be applied. There would be no more further annexation, and it happened. Then after the War of Independence, 1857, Britishers did not annex any Indian state. Then the most important that was the EIC, East India Company. The East India Company had become sort of had an image of the monsters in the eyes of the India because they were basically involved in economic exploitation. They were in the forefront just to appease the Indians. They just stopped functioning EIC in India. Practically, it was disbanded. Although formally it was this disbanded as a company in 1877 in UK, but in India they just stopped EIC working anymore in India. That was a positive contribution. Fourth, rise of the Indian nationalism. Although Indian lost, but uh, in a one way or other way, the awareness increased across the India that we must end foreign rule. It gave Indian a political awareness, even uh, uh, formation of certain association, even formation of the Congress is that was established in 1885. That was direct outcome of the one of the positive impact of the War of Independence. Although it had certain obvious negative aspects as well. For example, the formal ending of the Mughal Empire, it was announced in somewhere 1858. Although it had weakened, but still it has a symbolic value for the Indians, for the Muslims, that if there was any sort of succession ceremony or new the taking of the power by the new princely says it was the certificate was always issued from the Mughal emperor in Delhi. So there was a some symbolic value of the Mughal emperor. Mostly as a whole, Indians suffered, uh, but Muslims were more enthusiastic in the War of Independence for the obvious reason. Muslims were more enthusiastic because before EIC, there was a Muslim rule, Mughal rule. So British is considered uh, Muslims basically mainly responsible for the war. So they persecuted them more severely. For example, financial uh, funding of the Muslim schools was stopped. They uh, they were always suspicious of the Muslim activities. Severe actions were taken against the Muslims who, although that was against the Hindus as well, but mostly against the Muslims who were in a one way or other way involved in the war. Then they started preferring Hindus over Muslims in the government jobs. This also negatively, it was also in a one way negative contribution as a whole for the Indians as well, because Muslims, this also negatively affected in a way, it created sort of differences between Hindus and Muslims. When Hindus were preferred, that was disliked by the Muslims. The most important was the reduction of uh, Indians in the army. Before War of Independence, there was the ratio of 5-1. For example, if there would be the 5 Indians, at least there would be the one British. Now they reduce it to 2-1. Reason being, they wanted to be careful in the future. They wanted to keep the Indian uh, numerical strength under control. If such like situation happens again, they can manage. Yes. So Sayyid Ahmed was born in 1817 and died in 1898. There was some biographical background of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. The family of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was closely associated with the Mughal nobility. Sir Syed Ahmad's grandfather was once the prime minister or in a ministerial position in the Mughal Empire. So Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had very much exposure of the uh, Mughal Empire. His father was a very affluent when he was born. When he attained the school going age, he was uh, given the modern education of that times, the Persian medicine, etc. In 1838, Sir Syed Ahmed father died, so now it was difficult for him to continue his education. So he joined uh, printing press of his brother. He was Sir Syed Ahmad was offered a job even in the Mughal court, but he was a very literary sort of the person. He saw that he has no function in Mughal court because they have just to pray the king and nothing substantive he can do. So instead of joining the Mughal court, getting some official position there, he continued the printing work in the printing press. Then he joined uh, EIC as a sort of the record keeper that is known as a rishtedar, but in the EIC code. But then he also continued his education in the law. He did his law degree. Then he was appointed in the uh, as a uh, judge as well. He was a literary person even before War of Independence, 1857. He was involved in many literary activities. For example, in 1846, he wrote a famous book name is Asar, Asarul Sanadi. That was written on the historical sites of the Delhi, most prominent one. When War of Independence broke out in 1857, Sir Syed Ahmed was a chief judge in Indian city of the Bijnor. There, when war broke out, a lot of people were being killed, especially Indians were targeting Britishes. There in 1857, he saved many British lives. So when war ended, uh, Britishers knew the contribution of Sir Syed for the saving many British's lives. So they offered him a sort of great Jagir, great land, but he refused. But what he was more concerned, he was very much shocked on the later development of the War of Independence. There were many closely associated sort of relatives who were involved in this War of Independence. He realized that was not the opportune time. He thought that most Britishes are too powerful to be removed from India. So in other way, he tried to convince the Muslims that it would be better for the Muslims, especially and Indians, that they should come in terms with the British. They cannot remove them from India. As a whole, the contribution of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan we can divide in main 5 headings. One was the most important was the encouraging the growth of the Western education. Then there was a religious contribution of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, increasing political awareness, development of the two nations theory. The most important being the improving Muslim-British relations. That was two-sided. First, he tried to convince the Muslims that they should realize that they cannot remove British from India. although he was criticized on that account as well. On the other side, he also tried to pacify the British that they should not keep Muslims responsible. For that reason, he wrote two booklets. One was known as Causes of the Indian Revolt, in which he wrote that there was a certain administrative failures at the part of the British. Partly, they were also responsible because they were not they were not listening Indian views. If they had any grievances, those were not addressed. Although many Britishes saw it negatively, how he can blame us for the war. But there were a lot of British who saw that with a sympathy. They realized that there is a substance in the narration of Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan. This way, he tried to remove the impression that only Muslims are responsible. But British would consider that was true as well, that Muslims are mainly responsible, and they were seeing them with suspicion. Just to address that issue, he wrote another pamphlet named Loyal Muhammadan. That was series of the booklets. In that Loyal Muhammadan, he was mentioning the services of the Muslims for the British, just to make the points that Muslims should not be considered disloyal. And at the educational level, Muslims were not interested getting the modern education in government schools. Reason being, they were seeing that English is being taught, science is being taught. They were considering that un-Islamic. There was no religious education there. So he thought he made a new idea. He established one a modern school in Muradabad in 1859. What was the formula there? There was a religious education and modern education as well. So that was a success. After that, he opened another modern madrasa in Ghaziabad in 1863. That was a success. Later on, he also established scientific society. What was the main function of the scientific society? All the scientific works in Europe were translated in Urdu. Then those were printed for the Muslims so that they can understand about the scientific advancement. Even in scientific society, the views of Muslim scholars were also published. He also published another magazine known as Tehzeebul Akhlaq. In that, he published the uh, articles of the Muslims, whether they were the Arabs or non-Arabs, about the modern education, who were supporting the views of the Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan that Muslims should also acquire the modern education. The most important contribution of Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan was the establishment of the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental School in 1875. How he was inspired? In 1871, he went to UK, he visited Oxford and Cambridge University. He just dreamed if he could also open such type the institution in India for the Muslims. But for uh, political and financial reasons, that was not possible. So when he came back on that lines, he first uh, established Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental School in 1875. Then it became the college in 1877, and after his death in 1920, it became the university. He also uh, established an organization named Muhammadan Educational Conference in 1886. What was the main function of the Muhammadan Educational Conference? That was a social, basically. It used to conduct at annual level conferences across the India where Muslim sort of intellectuals and scholars were meeting there. They were discussing how Muslims' education can be improved and how can they open the modern educational institutions. That was the main purpose of the Muhammadan Educational Conference. But uh, it also became, although it was not intended for that, sort of the political forum for the Muslims, because when they were meeting across the India, they were also discussing the political ideas as well. That Mohammedan Educational Conference was mainly, in a way, responsible for the establishment of the Muslim League as well. As there was the annual session of the Mohammedan Educational Conference in Dhaka in December 1906. There they conceived the idea that they should have their own political party. That Mohammedan Educational Conference was mainly behind the similar deputation as well, the October 1906, and they persuaded the British government at that time for the separate electorates. At a political level, uh, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan was opposed to the establishing of the